All right, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to talk about gangs. And let's start off here with a little summary of what we're going to do. We're going to look a little bit into the criminal subcultures of gangs. We're going to talk about what exactly is a gang and what are the different types of gangs, and look at some of the internal and external factors about being about uh, gang membership, and also talk about the evolution of gangs over time. So let's start with what are some of the types of gangs. So we think about gangs as Crips and Bloods, right? Traditional street gangs, but in fact, it's just one of many. What other we also talk about when we talk about gangs, we're also referring to prison gangs, biker gangs. Of course, Waco has an interesting history with biker gangs, hate gangs, subversive gangs like terrorism or paramilitary organizations, the cartels, and the sort of general organized crime, or sort of you refer to as the mafia in the United States. But when we think about gangs, though, especially when we think about gangs and criminology, and we often think about street gangs. So let's talk about a little bit about the evolution of street gangs in the United States. So we've had gangs since the 1800s in this country, and normally they were formed around ethnic groups for people who, when they would move to the United States, gangs would form for protection. And in the 1920s, we saw the formation of youth gangs in major cities throughout the United States, again, primarily for protection. In the 1950s to 1960s, we saw the formation of what we can think of today as sort of traditional street gangs, which we talked a little bit about this in Cohen's work. Some were more organized than others. Some had names, some did not. These gangs were often territorial, based on neighborhoods people lived in. Now, the 1960s was an interesting time period for gangs in the United States, because out of the California prison system emerged three, and then later a fourth major prison gang. And the first and the initial is the Mexican Mafia, which is made up of primarily inmates from Southern California. Then at the same time, a group called the Black Guerrilla Family, made up largely of black inmates, formed in the California prison gangs. And the white prison gang at the time was that formed, which is also still around today, the Aryan Brotherhood. In more recent times, a Northern California gang, which is sort of referred to as La Familia, but it's not its official name. Its official name is something else. But anyhow, that was a rival gang of the Mexican Mafia, and this was a Hispanic gang, largely from Northern California counties. The 1970s up through the end of the 1990s saw the formation and proliferation of what we call large corporate street gangs, or for-profit gangs. And then the Crips and the Bloods have kind of gone through several transformations, but at one time they were one of these, or significantly affiliated with one of these corporate street gangs. So these are for-profit gangs. What I mean by that is that they're in business to make money, and that's one. It's not the only thing they do, but it is one of their primary motivations. And they made money through drug trade and open-air drug markets, selling largely weed, heroin, and most importantly, crack. Probably the best example of this type of gang is the Gangster Disciples in Chicago. And so essentially the gangs were hierarchical. They had leaders, they had people who worked under them, they had street level dealers, etc. And the whole idea was to sell drugs on the streets in open air markets. What I mean by an open air market is that people would stand on street corners and people would drive up and buy drugs and then drive off. That was the primary way in which drugs were delivered at the time. And since then, though, since the year 2000, we've seen traditional street gangs reemerge and replace, and that corporate gangs have really been on the decline. So the Gangster Disciples and some of the others we'll talk about in a book we're going to read have kind of disappeared, or they're still around, but they don't really have the same swag that they used to. What's happened is many of the big corporate gangs have broken up into a very small, but a large number of very small local street gangs. And then when I say street gangs, I mean that literally it's you live on this street, you belong to this gang. If you live the next street over, you'd have to belong to that gang. They're not nearly as big as they used to be in terms of numbers. All right, studying gangs is hit or miss. It's hard to get consistent information. It's hard to find people who are willing to admit that they're even in a gang, depending on where they live. Now, when we talk about these gangs, street gangs versus biker gangs versus prison gangs, we talk about them in terms of being binary, whether you're a member or not, or whether you're a member of one type of gang but not another. But there are many types of gangs, and oftentimes they overlap, and there's a lot of affiliation. So the prison gangs, for example, are highly affiliated with a lot of the street gangs and basically the street gangs do lots of work for them. So, for example, the Mexican Mafia is the most well-known prison gang. It's the oldest prison gang. And when you see gangs that have the number 13 involved with them, like MS-13 is a well-known gang in the United States and throughout Central America. The reason why they have 13 at the end is for MM, Mexican Mafia. It's a sign of respect, and it's also a sign that there's some sort of affiliation there. Street gangs were for-profit drug trade gangs in the 1970s and throughout up till about the year 2000, and they were organized into hierarchies. As I said before, you had the OGs, the original gangsters. These are the people who ran the gangs. They don't get their hands dirty anymore. The street level warriors get their hands dirty. Then you had hardcore members and regular members and wannabes, and then relatives of people who were in the gangs. They were the source of income for these was drug trade. And crack cocaine was the number one thing sold in open air markets. People would drive up, buy crack, and then drive off, or walk up, buy crack, and walk off. Why do people join these gangs? Well, to go back to look at a couple of theories in human ecology theory, there were push factors. There were poverty, high levels of population density, and lots of population turnover, which we mentioned in chapter 5. There was a breakdown of social institutions in an area, and a failure of the economy to bring jobs to those neighborhoods, a failure of the economy to sustain families, to provide for good schools, a lack of faith in the police, that they would come and solve problems, and some people also blame a breakdown in religious norms and values. Others argue that gangs provide what we call an alternative and an alternate status system. And what I mean by that is that where do we get our status from? Our sense of self comes from, the way others perceive us, right? And what's argued here is that the gangs provide this alternative status system from where you can get respect. You can't get it from regular society if you grow up and you don't have money and you don't have a high level of education, etc. But you can get it from the other people who belong to your gang. So the open air drug trades offered alternative financial systems. Remember when we talked about innovators in Merton's theory, drug trade is a source of money. And so when open air drug markets, you can sell crack cocaine, you can sell marijuana, you can sell heroin, and make money. Now, when you're working for one of the big corporate gangs, if you're a gangster disciple member, the money you make on the street corner isn't yours. You've got to pass it up the line. The actual profits go to the big guys at the top. But the system is based on respect. The alternative value system is based on respect. So as we've seen in the Code of the Street, there's a reason why people get involved in the activities they get involved with is not so much about, and it may not often be about money, it can often be about respect. But the status that you get from this alternative system is localized, and then what It's non-transferable, as Dr. Anderson says. And what that means is that just because you're a big dog in this neighborhood with this gang doesn't mean that transfers to another neighborhood or another situation with you. And also it means that in non-gang society, nobody recognizes your gang status as being something to be proud of. All right, well, what are some of the push factors? Some of the pull factors. What are some of the things that people find attractive about gangs? So, why do people join gangs? Well, for a variety of reasons. Socialization, you get to hang out with other people, excitement, status and respect, sometimes money, access to drugs, protection is big, and just a sense of belonging. Okay. Secondly, one of the pull is, again, at least historically in gangs, throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was access to illegitimate opportunity structures. In other words, access to crime-based forms of income. So if we look at some of the gangs, some of the top gangs in the United States today, the Trinitarios, they're a Dominican gang in New York. Barrio Azteca is a gang in Texas on the East Coast. It's been affiliated with the Juarez cartel. The Rollin 60 Crips are a sort of a earlier version of the Crips gangs that emerged from Los Angeles. The Mexican Mafia is the prison gang. It's the oldest, and I've already told you the story of the 13. MM, Mexican Mafia. M is the 13th letter in the alphabet. So people whose gangs are affiliated with, so a new gang that starts in Los Angeles that's affiliated with the Mexican Mafia, they may be doing some cartel work for them, etc. They will oftentimes pick up the number 13 in their name. The Bloods, you've heard of before. The Mongols are an outlaw motorcycle gang that have been at war with the Hells Angels. It is the gang which the show Sons of Anarchy is based on. They've also been linked to the Banditos, one of the gangs that motorcycle gangs that got into the fight here in Waco in the Mother's Day shootout a few years ago. So we're going to read in the book about this Chicago Splinter War. So here are the three big for-profit gangs I talked about earlier that ran Chicago for the longest time: the Gangster Disciples, the Hit Squad, and the Kill Award. And so we're going to talk about the book. We're going to read a book about why things are so violent in Chicago right now. And this book's going to talk about the downfall of these gangs and the emergence of splinter gangs and the violence that comes with them. The Aryan Brotherhood, it's a prison gang. It's a white prison gang. It's highly organized. It's across, just like the Mexican Mafia, it's across many prisons. It's kind of given up its racist foundation, although not completely. It's a close ally of the Mexican Mafia. A few years ago, it's been more than a few, I guess about 10 years ago, there were two murders in, I believe, of judges and a prosecutor in Kaufman County. And the original suspects in the case were the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. They thought it was an Aryan Brotherhood hit. I mean, if you're in the Aryan Brotherhood, when you get out of prison, you don't leave the Aryan Brotherhood. What you wind up doing is their bidding while you're out of prison. And also, if you join that gang while you're in prison, your family outside of prison is going to do favors, is going to run errands for the Aryan Brotherhood. And so I'll just leave it at that. It's not a life you want to live. It turns out the Aryan Brotherhood did not kill those two people in Kaufman County. It was actually I think it was a love triangle going wrong or something. But in any event, they were the initial suspects because I think the judge who had been killed had prosecuted a number of the Aryan Brotherhood members. Barrio 18 is a very dangerous gang. It is the primary rival to MS-13. I mentioned in another clip. Nobody seems to understand. These are two gangs that were at one point affiliated with one another, and then something happened, and now their blood feud is one of the bloodiest in the Western Hemisphere. If you look at the death rates of people in Central America, it's almost impossible not to be able to link most of the murders there to one or two of these groups and their ongoing blood feud. And then, of course, the most lethal gang today is MS-13. It's a Salvadoran gang. It started in Los Angeles after the Civil War in El Salvador. Currently has about 10,000 members in the United States, about 70,000 worldwide. It's a close ally of Los Zetas cartel, and it is considered the most violent in the United States and the world. All right. So historically, these gangs have all played a role in the distribution of illicit drugs, particularly heroin, cocaine, and more recently, methamphetamine. I will say this, that the cartels use primarily, how do they get their drugs into the United States? Well, we'll talk about that when we get to that chapter, but their affiliation is primarily with gangs that are supported through the Mexican Mafia, the prison gang, and especially in California along the West Coast. The cartels do not use gangs that are non-Latino. So they will not use African American gangs or the Aryan Brotherhood to launder money or smuggle drugs, smuggle money out, which is laundering money, in and out of the United States. They work primarily with Latino gangs and almost exclusively through gangs that are affiliated with the Mexican Mafia. All right, those are drugs and gang violence. Of course, drugs. Well, why would drugs lead to violence? Well, like I've said before and many times in this class, it's about dispute resolution. If Exxon and Chevron have a dispute over an oil lease, they don't shoot it out in the streets to see who wins. I mean, as awesome as that would be, watching Exxon and Chevron executives, shooting at each other, they go to court, right? They hire all these attorneys and they go to court and they sue each other, and eventually it gets worked out. Well, if your drug dealer cheats you, or if one drug dealer tries to take the street corner from another drug dealer, you can't call the police, you can't hire a lawyer and fight it out in courts. It's illegal activity. So the only resolution is violence, and that's why there's so much violence associated with the drug trade. It's the same reason why there was so much violence associated with illegal liquor trade in the 1920s during Prohibition. It's how Al Capone became the infamous gangster he was, is through his non-reluctance to use violence in any situation to get his way. Drug trafficking requires networks, and that's why gangs are used because they have networks. That's why they're used to traffic drugs. And you can't regulate that underground economy like you regulate a regular economy. There are no corporate laws that apply to drug trade. There are corporate laws that apply to oil leases and gasoline and all the different legitimate products we buy. But there is no corporate law regarding illegal drug trade. It's usually violence that solves problems. All right, so in the book, Code of the Street, we see a lot, it's a study, these are gangs, and loosely organized gangs for sure, but there's a code that requires young men to display, nerve is what Dr. Anderson calls it. And the violence here is moralistic rather than random. In other words, there are legitimate reasons why you would engage in violence. Most of the crime in this area is actually property crime. And what the violence does is it's used within this moral system, and it's used to regulate the drug trade. So what about a moral system? So let's say somebody's grandmother gets robbed coming home with her Social Security check, grandmother from the neighborhood. That's a violation of the Code of the Street. So there would be violence taken out on the person who did that. Okay? It's a situational approach to violence. There's lots of bluster and bluff that predominate. Actual little physical fighting is actually done. And most people don't just walk around violently punching people. It's not just this constant battle going on in these neighborhoods, but there is this sort of underlying threat of violence that's always there. And at any moment, you have to be ready to defend yourself or to engage with someone. And the violence that occurs is inefficient. And what I mean by that is that when the mafia kills people, John Gotti, when he killed people, he said, when he was arrested and put in prison, he said, I never killed anybody who didn't deserve it. Okay? I never killed a good person by accident. Violence in the code of the streets, however, is not as efficient as it is with the mafia. And innocent bystanders get killed. We see the stories about the people murdered in Chicago over the weekend. We're going to spend some time talking about this book. Lots of innocent bystanders. The people who killed are oftentimes not even affiliated with any of this stuff. It's just the violence, the way it's enacted, it's sudden, it's rapid. Before you know it, people are shooting at each other and people are fleeing. And there are people lying dead in the streets. It's not like a mafia hit. Okay, I'm going to stop there for the time being. All right, let's talk about some of the sociological patterns we've noticed with gang violence. First and foremost, people who are active in gang life, one of two things happens. They either die or they age out of it. They get tired of it. And the age at which people age out of gang life is getting younger. But, when the gangs were the hierarchical for-profit gangs, you could hang on for a longer time because the further you got up the hierarchy in the gang, the less close to the violence in the street level activities you actually, were. In other words, the higher you got, the cleaner your life was, and all you had to do was sit back and collect money and count money. The younger people were doing all of the dirty work on the street. But with the way the gangs are today, and it's, there's not as much money to be made in gang life, and so people are aging out quicker. It's almost exclusively young men, 15 to 25 years of age. And the gang life is based almost exclusively on an exaggerated conceptions of masculinity. Okay, so hypermasculinity predominates throughout. The other downside of gang life for locals is that what it does is it basically just creates further social disorganization in neighborhoods that were already suffering from disorganization to begin with. It makes a bad situation worse. Some of the subcultural issues with gangs are understanding their belief systems, understanding that they celebrate defiant and unconventional behavior, and understanding the importance of outgroups in maintaining identity. You got to have a common enemy. So MS-13 wouldn't be able to recruit members that they do in the places they do without the enemy of Barrio 18. Okay, so and vice versa, Barrio 18 would not be able to recruit members and socialize them into the barrio life without the existence of MS-13. So you always have to have that rival gang out there. That out-group, what it does is it creates solidarity among the in-group. The existence of the Bloods makes the Crips a more tighter and better functioning group. And gangs become reference groups. And in your reference group is what you look to judge your behavior. Am I doing what my fellow gang members would expect me to do? So you have to, and this is done through a process of internalization of norms. So what I mean by that is that you internalize the rules of the gang, the way that you're supposed to live your life as a gang member. And it's when your gang becomes your reference group. That's what it's important for people to understand about gang behavior, is that they're following their reference group norms. They're not following the norms of normal society. They're following the norms of the reference group. All right, we're going to stop right there.